In part 1 of this video, Trina worked with codes that represented discursive features, then read many quotations to reflect on the patterns, but she did not represent the patterns of discursive features themselves within ATLAS.ti. Here is an alternative way to fulfill the analytic task. In step 3 of translation, we had identified networks as a potential component to display all the discursive feature codes and to generate potential pattern codes, and this is what we will now do, as it says in the explanation. Rather than output the data from ATLAS.ti in order to reflect on it and organize the patterns in Word, we will inductively identify patterns of the most prevalent discursive features by working with them and the underlying coded quotations in a network. I'll demonstrate the additional steps of the constructed tool to accomplish this. Import discursive feature codes to a network, inductively identify pattern codes, write interpretations in code comments, and then export the codes with comments. You may want to follow along on this analytic planning worksheet, which you can print out from the web page. This alternative approach goes hand in hand with identifying the initial discursive features at a more detailed level, so that the work of generating the patterns of discursive features as a separate set of codes is accomplished in the network. This is the ATLAS.ti project for the 4th stage that Trina demonstrated in her case illustration video, and I'll just open the Code Manager, which shows that the analysis of the replies to the initial posts, shown in 11 discursive feature codes in their final form, after several rounds of interpreting the quotations, and as a result of that reading, renaming and merging the initial more numerous set of codes, led to the final most frequently used codes expressed as 3 patterns of discursive features that will be reported in the article. The disadvantage here is that the interpretation process and the refinement of the discursive features is somewhat hidden and no longer available to view, unless a series of ATLAS.ti projects were saved with different names at every step of renaming and merging codes so that the whole interpretation process could be reconstructed. This disadvantage is avoided by initially identifying more detailed discursive features and then using the networks to display these codes and interpret and generate the patterns, rather than merging codes. This allows the whole process to remain visible. Here is a different version of the project, and I'll open the Codes Manager, select the reply codes that Trina is working on in this stage of the project, and you'll see that I've broken down the list of reply codes to a hypothetical larger set of more detailed discursive feature codes. Of course, a potential disadvantage of this alternative tactic is methodological, if the process of analyzing discourse is weakened by separating out discursive features at this more detailed level like this. But our job here is to show that alternative tactics for fulfilling a task are always available. And while part of the choice of software tactics is the context of the task that you're now familiar with, meaning what we've done so far and what we plan to do next, another part of the choice is methodological, which is why we display levels 1 and 2 on the analytic planning worksheet. The next step of the constructed tool is to import discursive features to a network. I'm going to bring all the codes into the network, not just the most prevalent ones, but Trina had been interested in the most prevalent codes, so perhaps I'll color the most prevalent ones with a different color to remind me easily as we're working on them in the network which are the most prevalent ones. First I sort by groundedness, and then color differently, say the ones with more than 25 quotations. And then I'll create the network. I also want to see the number of quotations attached to each code as I work, so I'll switch that indicator on, and then move the codes around into the bigger space. The next steps are inductively identify pattern codes and write interpretations in code comments, which really go together. This process involves picking a code, I'll start with the most prevalent one, reading the code comments, reviewing the quotations one by one, and as each one comes up, it opens its document. And at some point, I will have read enough to write an interpretational comment on the code. And then I repeat this for the other prevalent codes and other codes that seem to be related, a very iterative process of reading and writing. And at some point, you might want to display all the interpretational comments as you work to make it easier. And at some point, you might decide on a pattern of discursive feature of the codes. And to construct this, it may be easier to turn off the comments and move the relevant codes. Perhaps the code's initial statement, "so sorry," and "welcome to the group," and link those appropriately. And then find perhaps "extend sympathy," which you realize is the name of the pattern itself, and link that appropriately. And then we can do the same for these codes, which we might think of as a pattern called "encourage membership." So we create a new code, and link its discursive features. And then perhaps we'll decide to make all our pattern codes in capital letters and make these codes white to distinguish them and link them together in a sequence. That is now shaping up as the structure of the narrative that we will later flesh out when we write it up in Word. We might decide the discursive feature code "second stories" is a pattern in itself, so we rewrite the name and change its color to white, and now these three will form the basis of our findings. The next steps are the same as in part 1 of the video. The original tactics to fulfill this task, which are to export codes with comments, and then we can open the exported file in Word to produce the final write-up of the pattern narrative. I won't demonstrate that last step. This alternative way of fulfilling task 12b has both pros and cons, which need to be thought through when moving from step 3 of translation, identifying the possible components, to step 4, which is choosing which components to translate to. So here are some examples of this thinking process. First, this approach involves initially creating more detailed discursive codes, which delays the identification of any patterns until all discursive features have been considered, and avoids too early settling on final conclusions, which is warned against in some methodologies. This means a staged process, first finding discursive features without attempting to relate or conjoin them until all have been discovered, and then re-examining them to identify patterns. This is no doubt what Trina actually did using the original tactics, part in ATLAS.ti and part in Word, but a case can be made that her process may have been less efficient than conducting the process all within ATLAS.ti. But a possible disadvantage of this approach is that this staged process of finding all individual unrelated discursive features before relating them may not reflect the intentions of the discourse analysis interpretive process. A second consideration is that all the building blocks of the interpretive process are maintained in the network, rather than disappearing as individual discursive feature codes are merged and renamed. This facilitates reconsidering relationships and interpretations and changing your mind as further issues are considered, which may mitigate against the concern I just expressed about the nature of this holistic methodology. This tactic provides a permanent audit trail of how the interpretations proceeded, as none of the building blocks, the individual discursive feature codes, and the build-up of interpretive writing in the code comments are lost, and I'm not aware of any disadvantages of maintaining the audit trail in this way. So this completes our look at an alternative way of conducting Trina's analytic task number 12b.